Thank you guys for coming. It's great to see you, to see some of you, faces that I know, some faces I don't know. Very exciting. I'm Isabella Livorni. I am on faculty here at NYU. Rosselli is a main part of my research, and so it's particularly exciting to be able to have as our guests these wonderful speakers and experts. So I'm going to first introduce Phil and Andrea. Andrea di Serego. Serego, okay. Pronunciation. But I wanted to check that. I want to just make sure that we understand, right? Phil, Andrea are going to present. Jennifer is going to also present. And I will give some remarks, open up a Q&A among the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to you all. So have some questions ready. I know you got it, Nicola. So starting off with Phil, and I'll move out of the way. Phil Baber is a typographer, editor, and writer. He co-founded The Last Books, a small press for experimental poetry and poetics, and is co-organizer of Don't Pay Your Rent, an occasional reading series held at Rietveld Women's Office in Amsterdam. He teaches at the Gerrit Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam and the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, and is currently a research fellow at the Royal Academy in Antwerp, where he's working on a book about the typography of verse. Andrea di Serego Alighieri is a doctoral student at the University of Oxford. His project starts from the discrepant engagement between two post-war translingual poets, Amelia Rosselli, Paris, 1930 to 1996, and Kamau Brathwaite, Bridgetown, 1930 to 2020. It explores how the intersection of page, space, margin, and typeface, and verse, meter, rhythm, and prosody, come to embody experiences of diaspora while casting unique forms of individuation and community. Alongside his doctoral work, he works as a graphic designer, translator, and editor, most recently of works by American poets Lynn Higinian, my girl, and Alice Notley. Since 2020, he has been a lecturer and thesis tutor at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Antwerp. And so Phil and Andrea, I believe, are going to give us a presentation of the work that you just... Or Andrea is going to be point person.
Primarily, and Phil can...
Phil will jump in. On their most recent volume and translation that has just come out with Jennifer as well. And Jennifer, we will introduce you in due time. I am just going to make sure that it's shared. And you want me to do full kind of...
Does it look right? Supposed to?
No?
Yeah.
Enable...
No, what is it again? Full screen mode. There we go.
That's how you get to say that the book's
Take a chance then.
All right, I'm just going to...
Are you sure? Or I can also join with another chair.
No.
Okay, wait. So, everybody can hear me. Hello, thank you for coming. First of all, I would like to thank Isabella for welcoming us in this beautiful library. I want to thank NYU, the Casa Italiana, for the same thing. And I would like to thank Jennifer also for joining this presentation as well as participating in the volume. And I want to thank my friend Phil and the publisher of the book that made this whole thing possible in all sorts of level. A bit of a sad news. We tried to get the books in time shipped to New York. They are stuck in New Jersey somewhere. They are not letting them through because of customs. Maybe it's some kind of 1st of May sabotage. Or it's just the usual sort of sabotage. So sorry that the books are not here. They will probably arrive tomorrow. So if any one of you is interested to have a copy, we probably can try to leave them at the Casa and then have them you can pick them up and so on. So you will see the digital version of the volume behind me. Shall I just press play or I just move,
Maybe
scroll through it. So perhaps the first words I will say, they're just more related to the editorial structure of the volume. Let me just go to the editorial. So just to say very bluntly what this book is about a talk that Amelia Rosselli gave in the 1980s in Rome, and it was a talk that was that happened on request of Elio Pagliarani, an Italian poet, friend and a colleague of Rosselli. Pagliarani organized often in those years in Rome a lot of poetry readings, but especially in those years, around the 1980s, organized a lot of readings regarding meter, because meter was somehow a topic discussed by poets in Italy at that time. Rosselli read this talk probably at the same in the same evening that Alfredo Giuliani, another Italian poet and critic, literary critic, read another talk, most probably from how much we could gather, regarding projective verse from Charles Olson and a recent translation that he did on the essay. So it was a whole evening dedicated to meter in the 80s, which is not to say. It's kind of a quite an exceptional sort of topic for the 80s in 1980s in Italy, because maybe, as you could guess, free verse was maybe the kind of fashion at that time, and these authors, they said, no, we need to talk about meter, we need to talk about what could be understood as close verse as versus free verse. The transcription that we relied upon is made by Paola Febbraro, also a poet, a friend of Rosselli, a very minor poet, a very good poet, very unknown, that died prematurely, and recorded this talk, and unfortunately we couldn't get to the actual recording, and we relied on the incomplete transcription that is included in the Meridiano of Rosselli. What is Metrical Spaces? Metrical Spaces. Sorry, what is this talk about? This talk is a talk about metrical spaces, an essay Rosselli wrote as an afterword or as a kind of compendium to her volume Variazioni Belliche in 1964, published in 1964. And Metrical Spaces was somehow, or it is common knowledge by now, prompted by a request from Pierpaolo Pasolini for her to explain her metrical theories. And Rosselli somehow struggled against the fact that Pasolini asked to explain herself to an extent, but also took the chance to really put down on paper some issues that were really at the core of her poetics. Not to forget to say that although this was intended as a kind of didactic and sort of needed explanation that accompanied the volume of Variazioni Belliche, it was also largely under-acknowledged and unread by her contemporaries. Pasolini himself, he didn't really understand what Rosselli was speaking about. Rosselli has a few interviews in which she kind of accounts for that misunderstanding. So not only misunderstanding, but also a level of misrecognition, I would say. The reason why Phil and I decided to publish this talk is because she repeatedly, around the 80s, the essay is written in 1964. It's actually written before, but published in 1964, together with Variazioni Belliche. Rosselli repeatedly tried to explain this essay out loud in the years that led to her premature death in the 90s, in the late 90s. What Phil and I wanted to do is to sort of give back some attention to this perhaps lost or unavowed discussion that Rosselli wanted to share with her readers and share with her audience. Practically, the publication consists in the translation of this talk. It's punctuated by the tone and the rhythm of her voice. So, like any voice in informal speech, it also falters and jumps. So, us as editors and typographers, we try to translate that faltering, not trying to fill in these gaps, but try to keep them as such and sort of make them part of Rosselli's delivery. We introduced this typographical marker, which you can see quite evidently in the first page. It's a double M dash in typographical terms. So if you know what an M dash is, I won't maybe go into that, but we decided to do that also as a tribute, a silent tribute to Emily Dickinson, a poet that Rosselli translated and was very fond of. And if you know the work of Emily Dickinson, you know that she made a large use of dashes in her manuscript poems, so on and so forth. The volume is structured this way. So the first, besides basically a kind of a version of what I'm just saying out loud right now, an editorial, it starts with the translation. We also notice while translating, the translation sort of progressively, the text that Rosselli is delivering progressively sort of starts to scatter towards the end, because of course questions creep in from the audience, which we cannot really hear in the probably were not really hearable in the transcription, but we can definitely read in the transcription. But she wanted to read poems as well at the end of the talk, trying to demonstrate the theory. So it's important to say that we try to sort of perform a little bit of a speculative loose sort of interpretation of what poems she could have decided to read. Of course, there is no really, besides one poem, which is the last poem of Variazioni, there is not really like a precise list of what these poems were. But we decided to sort of nonetheless include some and translate them ourselves, trying to sort of, match this missing link that she would try to talk about and explain. All translations of the poems are ours, except from the poem from Impromptu, which is the first poem, which is translated and kindly donated in translation form by Gian Maria Annovi, which I also would like to thank, of course, for this, for his generosity in sharing his translation and his insights as well, because very importantly, at the centerfold of the volume, literally at the binding, we have included Jennifer Scappettone's revised translation of Metrical Spaces, which is the essay that Rosselli is glossing throughout the talk, and it comes as a primary, as well, a primary sort of literary object printed on yellow paper. So that's for the editorial. There is much more to say, of course, but I guess we can maybe touch upon some of these things, especially regarding typography and the rendering of the book and how that reflects Rosselli's wishes or ideas. And right now I wanted to share with you a few thoughts that would contextualize the existence of this talk on print, in print right now, and basically ask the question why to bring this forth in 2025 in relation to, let's say, Italian studies, but also to more broadly to a discussion that has to do with poetry, but as well with the question of what the Italian language is and has become, perhaps. In order to do that, I will try to go through my afterword in a kind of selected way, in which I will try to read you most of it, but I will also skip through some things because it's the time is limited. How am I doing with time? It's all right. So perhaps I will just enter it and then we will step into the discussion. Rosselli's talk opens with an apology. Perdonatemi, forgive me. Forgiveness is a recurring theme in her poetry, a gesture intricately bound with love, reverence, a kinship with otherness. Famous poem from her, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me, I loved you, I would have loved you, I love you, and it's yours, the life that I have lost. This translation is from Jennifer Scappettone. Thank you, Jennifer. If you were to indulge in her peculiar system of correspondences, we might ask, what does Rosselli love about meter? Perhaps the most striking aspect of her attraction, and of a talk more generally, more broadly, is her attempt to liberate meter from a rigid and ostensibly timeless definition, and instead emphasize its dynamic historical nature. Prior to the 1950s, Italian theories of meter and prosody were largely shaped by formalist and classicist-inspired handbooks that upheld conventional notions of measure, gender, and national identity. As Meredith Martin points out, the proliferation of prosodic theories in English in the 19th and 20th centuries was primarily aimed at establishing a metrical system that, quote, could reflect the greatness of English poetry and adequately measure the English language. This perspective, I think, is equally relevant to the Italian context, where Rosselli stands out as one of the few writers to have critically examined and disrupted this equation. For Rosselli, meter was deeply connected with biography, a perspective she shared with Franco Fortini. And here I quote Fortini, I have always known that there is a connection between the union contracts of our time and the way we interpret a canzone by Petrarch, just as there is between the cognitive manipulation of contemporary consumerism and the lexical and syntactic choices of the sentences I am producing. Though they arrive at different formal conclusions, both poets, prompted by their readings of Marx and Gramsci, advocate for poetic structures that embody internal contradictions, much as a social body follows a revolutionary motion towards its own form. Marked by her trilingual diasporic background as a war refugee, Rosselli's poetry collides Anglo-Saxon and Romance roots into a biographical inscriptional gesture that challenges the unified history of Western prosody. Formed as a poet, as we know, in French and above all in English literature, she may have been influenced, at least in her early writings, by Fortini's overlooked idea that Italian poetry in the second half of the 20th century follows an accentual logic based on 3, 4, or 5 main accents. This is an insight I gather from Emanuela Tandello, Rosselli's translator and friend, from recent correspondence that I could view unpublished and even unarchived, so private correspondence that they shared. Fortini called it centroid. We can go into that. It's very specific, very maybe for now. As she writes in Diario Intralingue, compare Italian, French, and English accentuate meters and origins, also German. Given that linguistic governance is a crucial aspect of fascist ideology, it is no coincidence that Rosselli's early writings, primi scritti, are marked by a potent and unruly trilingualism. As she puts it in a note found among her papers by Emanuela Tandello, all the migrations I was obliged to go through produced a linguistic and permanently inconsistent dissociation. Language reflects such a situation. This dissociation rubs against the conventional understanding of meter as an abstract, idealized pattern, embedded in a specific nation or culture. Instead, Rosselli interprets it through rhythm and sound, that is, through embodied discourse and the facts of biography. Just 10 years prior to the publication of Metrical Spaces, and around the same time Rosselli began working on her essay, French linguist Émile Benveniste published an essay called The Notion of Rhythm in its Linguistic Expression. In the study, Benveniste disentangled the meaning of the word rhythmos from its atomistic association with schema, form, and reconnected it to its etymological root reo, to flow. Rather than the stable element of a shape, he described rhythm as a flow-like movement of nature, a succession of configurations that are not fixed but evolve in time. This deplatonizing insight significantly, albeit indirectly, influenced Rosselli's poetics. And I'm thinking here of Fortini that read Benveniste, Pasolini that read Benveniste, but there is not really a trace of Benveniste in Rosselli's library so far. In a talk This is evident in her repeated desire to render Italian as a more liquid language, following not its so-called, quote-unquote, natural rhythm, but that of English. Rosselli's rereading of meter through rhythm becomes a means of navigating the complexities of nation, identity, community, and language. This was only possible by tapping into the dark background of rhythmic experience, an unconscious or repressed aspect of form. In the wake of World War II, as Italy struggled to distance itself from fascism and colonialism, Rosselli was looking for elements that unified artistic practices and communication across languages, class, or nations. Well aware that contemporary ideas of universalism were deeply enmeshed with colonialism and imperialism, she turned her attention to marginal Italian poets, such as Dino Campana, Scipione, Lorenzo Calogero, and especially Rocco Scotellaro, while also pursuing field studies in ethnomusicology in southern Italy. I'm sure Isabella will be able to expand on that much more than I can do not right now. Browsing through her library, now archived in the University of Viterbo, one comes across dog-ear editions, surprisingly, of such books as Frantz Fanon's The Wretched or the Earth, in original, like in French, which, by the way, Fanon wrote in a conference in Rome in 1959. In a hindsight, it seems that, at least in her early years, she valued poets and cultural practices that, as Nathaniel Mackey puts it, quote, produce work of a refractory oppositional sort, where one hears the rumblings of some place of insubordination. Nathaniel Mackey is a contemporary American poet. Some of you might be familiar with him. This reading goes a little bit against of Stefano Giovannuzzi's idea that she doesn't perform or advocate for minor literature. I think, at least in the early stage, she definitely does. But why focus precisely on formal insubordination, you might ask? In 1957, at the same time as Rosselli was working on her essay, Franco Fortini wrote, once again, if rhythmic expectation is the anticipation of the confirmation of psychic identity through repetition, a repetition that is movement over time, thus surpassing itself with each new identification, metrical expectation is the anticipation of the confirmation of a social identity. Very complex wording. It's Fortini, Marxist, hardcore Marxist kind of formalization of a thought. But I think the idea of a confirmation of a social identity through form is essential also to Rosselli in this case. Metrical Spaces, which originated in an exchange between Rosselli and Preparo Pasolini, as I said before, was published in 1962, 2 years before Pasolini addressed the new language question. Although Pasolini's argument now seems short-sighted in its postulation of a dialectical opposition between a literary, written Italian and a technical neo-capitalist Koine, it is likely that his public re-evaluation of the Italian language encouraged Rosselli to think of poetic form as always ultimately ethical and political. In creating her own diasporic idioma trifarium, quoting Dante, Rosselli foresaw that the future symbiosis of Italian was not with technological or corporate language or corporate discourse, but with foreign tongues. And that's an argument that Mengaldo also, Pier Vincenzo Mengaldo, confirms in his book on the Italian literary canon. These, I think, are just some of the more obvious associations that can help situate metrical spaces and consequently a talk, not just within a debate amongst poets, but within a broader discourse on the fragility and faith of the Italian language in post-war Italy. In 1960s Italy, both national language and poetic language were in a state of infirmity. Rosselli begins her reading by stating that at the time she was writing, free verse had become exhausted. This could be understood in two ways: that verse had become weighed down by the individual poet's pressing subjectivity, and more broadly, that it could not accommodate the transformation of Italian from a literary language, a language of culture, to a globalized language of communication. In the context of post-war Europe, this infirmity touched Rosselli in an even more intimate way. Jennifer Scappettone's forthcoming book interestingly situates Rosselli amongst authors who compose in orphan tongues and occupy language, and this is a quote from Jennifer, occupy languages within a perceived birthright or sanctioned education. They occupy languages without a perceived birthright or sanctioned educations. As her library and archives reveal, at the time of her return to Italy in the late 40s, she was reading and attempting scansions, poetic scansions of Italian poetry, while simultaneously studying grammar and syntax in 6th grade school books. In Metrical Spaces, she writes that in the period when she was composing free verse, quote, reality was mine, not that of others. Thus, her proposal to reread the sonnets of the Italian schools should not be interpreted as a reactionary turn towards classicism, but rather as an attempt to appropriate the ruins of the literary canon, using them to prop up and organize a possible biographical narrative while postulating a new poetic grammar. Just as Franco Fortini described meter as a seashell in which an indistinct rumble is heard, so Rosselli conceived it as a concave space, a cavity for amplifying archetypical rhythmic cadences that are capable of collective transformation. By studying and experimenting with the canonical rhythms of the Italian language, what Gianfranco Contini once described as the inherent but long-lost rhythmic capability, quote, delivered by the last surgeons and notaries, and I would add, by farmers, workers, and mothers. Her goal was to discover a form of structure that would allow the reader, and potentially all readers, to access the poem's latent historicity, beyond the author's subjective particularity. At the same time, prompted in part by her studies in harmonics, she sought a way to contain and measure the informal registers of speech, along with their sonic and multilingual dimensions. As has recently been noted, a full awareness of a centuries-old metrical tradition only emerged once it was put into crisis, and the ability to write in closed forms seemed all the more mysterious, as well as more interesting, as it began to disappear. By inhabiting a type of verse that was not merely free, but in fact freed, that is, liberated from, yet still attentive to, the echoes of centuries-old metrical traditions, and here I refer to Mangaldo, Rosselli made a significant contribution to investigating and defining what would later be called the deep metricity of Italian post-war poetry. Likely prompted by her having to relearn Italian after her exile as a refugee of war, her study begins by questioning, in a manner more radical than any of her contemporaries, the most basic elements of Italian prosody. Emanuela Tandello noticed how, while maintaining a strong link with the verse of the lyrical tradition, Rosselli transformed it as if, quote, it were exploded from within. Similarly, Andrea Zanzotto, in his review of Documento, highlights her rare ability to relieve and reclaim our common language as it were a foreign language. In a talk, after stating that, quote, one speaks to me of feet without telling me what a vowel is, Rosselli provocatively identifies the unit of measure in the poem not as the syllable, which is the way that, let's say, Italian prosody or Italian meter would regularly go at it, but the word. As in classical metrics, it is not so much the internal accents of words that are at issue, but the intonation, duration, and sound of phrases. In contrast to traditional syllabic scansion, she proposes a kind of atonal prosody, which, as she writes, adapts to a tempo that is strictly psychological, musical, and instinctual. I use the word atonal referring to Alfredo Giuliani, that has a beautiful snippet in his only book published by Feltrinelli, highlighting, let's say, a little bit mapping out what Italian verse was, how Italian verse was structured. Sì, and then I wrap it up. As is evident throughout the talk, this stance was also informed by Rosselli's musicological background. Her studies at the Darmstadt School, she returned there in 1961, around the time she wrote the essay, encouraged her to compare the decline of canonical meter in 20th century poetry to the crisis of tonal temper systems in music and the exhaustion of free verse to the surpassing of 12th tone, post-12th tone compositional techniques. For Rosselli, closed meters hindered the poet's psychological expression, while free verse could reflect it, though at risk of egocentric saturation. This led her to experiment with seriality and expose the rhythms of the text in its lightless variations. Her first two major poetry collections reflect this in the wordings of their titles, Serie and Variazioni. As she explains in various passages in a talk, unlike written language, auditory experiences could, through their microscopic durations, introduce a peculiar form of critical universalism, reflecting that of all peoples, and consequently be reflected in all languages. The search for a pure sound, and we find it in reading the talk, could be interpreted as an attempt, what she defines as a sign in a very technical terms, could be interpreted as an attempt to forensically prove the existence of this universal sonic matrix. In a talk, there seems to be for Rosselli a crucial yet somewhat mystifying connection between the inscriptional typographic nature of poetry on the page and its sonic and temporal qualities. More precisely, the space-time correlation in 4 dimensions appears to be the grounds of her theorization of the poem on the page in Variazioni as a square. As she says in Metrical Spaces, all possible imaginable rhythms fill my square meticulously to timbral depth. The 4 dimensions of intensity, pitch, rhythm, and timbre, stretching the 2 dimensions of the square page into a cube, may suggest that Rosselli's focus is on the rhythm of the whole poem and its relation to others in the collection, rather than on the rhythm of individual verses. Rosselli's square seems to at once frame and resist time in that sense. She says, I took up again in hand my 5 classifications: letter, syllable, word, phrase, and sentence. I framed them, le inquadrai, in an absolute time-space. As Nicola Gardini writes in a key essay on Rosselli's poetry, and another quote, time becomes the volume of a cube. That is, depth through the waiting space between line and line. Although, like everything in Rosselli's system, the hierarchy between letter, syllable, word, and poem is often fluid, her conception of word as ideas led her in Variazioni Belliche to establish the word as the basic unit of measure. As Francesco Caborgnin has noted, Rosselli's verse, at least in Variazioni Belliche, is primarily characterized by an equal amount of words per line. And there are proofs of that, of her maybe measuring or with a ruler or counting the words. Meredith Martin identifies a similar trait in the poetry of William Carlos Williams and Charles Olson, defining it as isoverbal prosody. But Rosselli's isoverbalism is characterized by a peculiar duality. On the one hand, it alludes to a spatial and therefore visual and typographic dimension of the metrical structure, while on the other, it refers to the musical and sonic nature of verse and its relationship. Last paragraph. To summarize, but how does this all affect the reader? Antonio Loreto has noted that the peculiarity of Rosselli's metrical system lies in its imposition of a passive meter in writing and an active meter in reading. That is, 2 different hierarchies of relevance concerning the properties of a text. On one side, it is written in sentences. On the other, it is read in verses. If the text is the poem's medium, and if, as Nicola Gardini suggests, an idea of space-time in poetry can be defined primarily with respect to the form of the text, might the page, embodying the poem's absent plane, entrust the future reader, what Rosselli calls a folla immaginaria, with the task of chiseling it into verse, thus activating the substrate into which the inscription occurs? Rosselli's attempt to explicate her system might connect to what Pietro Beltrami referred to as a metrical reciprocity, where the full experience of a poem comes to life through a social relationship, a common understanding between poet and reader. What remains to be seen is whether this common ground can actually be accomplished, or whether, as Isabella Livorni suggests, Rosselli's poetry is characterized by the perpetual attempt and potential failure to record a form of transparent communication all over again. The answer might lie, as so often in Rosselli's poetry, in the oblique space of one of her shortest and more perfect poems, Seek Me and Banish. And here I finish. At the end of Metrical Spaces, just before declaring that reality is so heavy that the hand tires and no form can contain it, Rosselli defines meter through the oxymoronic binomial ideale-reale, a real ideal. Her understanding of meter as a common ground of perception and communication, one that could allow the self and the other to become mutually legible, resonates with Fortini's tenet that, quote, the metric institution is the inauthenticity that alone can establish the authentic. It is a form of collective presence. What we are left with, then, is a suggestion that thinking about meter entails both listening and diverging from tradition, proposing a form of individuation that could ground a community based not on mastery or dominance, but joint connivance and a studious indiscipline. Echoing Dante's modo, rooted into the Occitan mesura, Rosselli's verse might be fully felt only within the amorous tension between measure, pain, and desire. Sorry, that was too long.
No, thank you. There's a lot. A lot of notes, food for thought. I'm excited to hear also how Jennifer speaks. A lot of the short remarks I have echo in many ways, and I'm curious to hear Jennifer's take as well. Jennifer, are you ready? Oh, sorry, you're mute. Yeah.
Okay, so it's time for me.
Yes.
It's not time for Phil. Okay.
What I'm gonna do. Yeah, Phil, you have chosen to. You're gonna jump in the Q&A, but you've chosen not to. Okay. So Jennifer, I'm just gonna kind of see how much I can try to get you audible as well, but I don't know. We'll see.
Okay. How are people doing with how my volume level, and
Perfect.
Are you seeing the right slide, i.e. the title slide, without any other
Yes.
distraction? Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for including me in this really, somewhat experimental volume and this discussion. I find it really exciting, and if I had had such a brave publisher back in 2012 when I was publishing Locomotrix, I think I would have been able to translate the work in a different way. But I'm not going to be talking about the translation of Metrical Spaces. We could talk about that during. Andrea, Phil, and I agreed that I would speak a little about the centrality of Rosselli's metrical theories to my scholarship. And I'm going to take a few moments to describe their relation to my forthcoming book, Poetry After Barbarism, The Invention of Motherless Tongues and Resistance to Fascism. It is a book that charts the fugitive and dynamic mode of citizenship that can be embedded in poetic language. Specifically, translingual language crossing national lines, aimed directly or indirectly against the jingoistic monolingual agendas that mushroomed under fascism. I'm not going to launch a complete account of the argument, as it's quite complex and would distract from today's discussion. I only wish to underscore how the fascination of Rosselli's ambitious and perplexing theories have led to some 25 years of musing on and off the page about the relation of poetry to politics. In 1965, Rosselli, well into both musical and poetic study, and having just published her first collection accompanied by Metrical Spaces, would make a bold claim for the music that she was seeking. I aspire to pan music, to the music of everyone, of the earth and of the universe, in which an individual hand no longer governs. The statement speaks to her extensive readings in musicology undertaken as a young woman, resonating with the ideals of world harmony expressed in Alain Daniellou's work on tuning and vibration, which must have influenced her lifelong interest in the harmonic series. This ideal of arriving at the music of everyone, echoing antique notions of a universal musicality of the spheres, would find itself in constant battle, however, with the dissonance of her aesthetics, and what turned out to be Rosselli's irreparable status of outsider in every country and city, particularly given that her musicality ended up settling in the realm of language, a medium scored against pan-lyricism with geopolitical divisions. The paradox is registered in an Italian language entry from her Diario in Trilingue, in which notes on her evolving practice are woven through her other native tongues, English and French. The passage seems at first to be playing on the way that inverting the syntax of subject and verb and placing post-verbal subjects in different places produce slightly different emphasis in Italian in a way that is impossible in English. Si dimette dal Consiglio Municipale la flottiglia navale. Si dimette la flottiglia navale dal Consiglio Municipale. It goes on to produce a provocative parallel between the naval flotilla's parodic, because inappropriately placed, resignation from civic life and that of the speaker. Quote, "And I, who resign from the city council every day, ask myself if it wouldn't be possible in an absurd effort to forget how much is around me in order to enclose myself in the alchemies of a language good at every latitude." This fragment, whose final phrase is quoted often but out of context, articulates the dream of a transnational language. Yet the passage also voices the persecuting history of tension between active citizenship, such as that of her family, and the militant violence of the state that was to harrow Rosselli's oeuvre, charging and tormenting its political concerns and the non-national languages in which they become uncomfortably lodged. It is a history that influenced her stepping away or stepping down from the sphere of realpolitik and the compromised solutions of policy. The tension between the ideal of universal communication and the distressed poetic languages that arise from engagement with geopolitical fracture, too intimately experienced to idealize, led me to formulate this book project. The endeavor was born on the heels of a dozen years of work researching Rosselli in the service of an act of translation that was published in 2012. Such tension lent itself poorly, if at all, to any definitive edition of translations of Rosselli's Italian writings into English ones, though the pressure to be definitive haunted me as editor of an inaugural critical anthology of Rosselli's selected poetry and prose. Any labor of translation aiming at a so-called general public is assumed to transport the poem from one national language to another, but Rosselli's work properly resides in the lexical, syntactical, and sonic spaces in between. The piece of Rosselli's final sentence above that names the absurd effort of enclosing oneself in the oblivion of removal from actual conditions and in the plural alchemies of a language that would work at any point of the global north or south is anomalously lodged within quotation marks, as if to distance itself from the speaking subject and from reality. The conjectured alchemy was to be undertaken through the poetry Rosselli would develop over the course of decades of research and experimentation, a transformation of the fell matter of language into the would-be universal elixir of a lyricism lacking, or to be more accurate, exceeding an I. In Metrical Spaces, Rosselli identifies a musical, logical, and associative current beneath the seemingly singular language in which she writes, which brings all peoples together. If the poet's sonorous, logical, and associative experience is that of all peoples and reflectable in all languages, then this shared experience can be captured by a poetic stanza conceived as a capacious cube or square, permitting it to fill with the prosody of all languages, culling all possible imaginable rhythms within the space simultaneously. The dream of a poetry shot through with rhythms of languages the world over, a dream suspended, hovering over her poetic compositions, gave rise to the theoretical question at the heart of my book. The ideal of a language good at every latitude comes constantly into conflict with the actual lived experience of politically defined languages, their shibboleths and severances. The subjects of Rosselli's poetry cannot forget all that is around them, though their political surroundings might be reflected with extreme obliquity within the art of a unique sensibility galvanized and scarred by history. Still, the utopian search for a universal language remains staunchly articulated. Poetry after barbarism theorizes the xenoglossic, a Pentecostal resolution of the linguistic fractures of Babel that, I argue, sees an intensification in the context of 20th century global migration, telecommunications, and war. Rosselli's work taught me early on that xenoglossia, describing the speaking of natural languages to which one does not belong, doesn't have to represent an inspired speaking of the languages of others in the service of domination. It can constitute inspired use of dominant language from the perspective of a refugee, turning the power dynamic assumed by evangelist interpretations of Pentecostal communication across cultural boundaries on its head. All these years later, scholars and readers of Rosselli's poetry have still not exhausted the questions opened up by her invention of a cubic poetic stanza aimed at hosting all possible rhythms of all possible languages. Can poetry ever come to constitute a universal language, like its reputed corollaries, music, gesture, and painting? Is it possible to forge a universal poetry in a world of divisive national idioms, a world haunted by the specter of fascism? Are poets who transgress national grammars indeed capable of quashing the political boundaries between cultures that so often doom interchange? Or are they fated to the status of the barbarian? Rosselli's most prominent contemporary editor has taken a strict philological approach to spazi metrici and insisted somewhat patronizingly that it doesn't apply to her body of work as a whole, notwithstanding the poet's own claims to the contrary. I beg to differ. The very workshop that Andrea and Phil have decided to bring to the public eye as a whole shows that Rosselli was still working through these ideas in the early 1980s, a couple of decades after the tractate's initial conception and composition. While it is true that the poems of a book like Documento display no adamant visible relation to the cube form or the scroll that Rosselli invented, my contention is that the theoretical matrix of this tractate remains constant as aspiration, that its presiding ideals continue to haunt. That is, a certain understanding of language as containing all languages, albeit at an abstract rhythmic level perhaps, underpins Rosselli's work. A utopian carnalization of a fact that can be heard in her performing voice as what I call, and theorize, but I'm not going to theorize it here, a harmonic. And with that, I'd like to give her the last word by playing a segment of Impromptu, her last major work that might spark discussion, as I think of it as demonstrating the way that her performances contain the rhythms of multiple languages or lyrical logics in the same space, creating dissonance that yet articulates the harmonization of at least 3 languages within her own reciting, indeed singing voice. I'm going to...
Questa notte con
Sorry, I tried to cue, but it doesn't work. Here we go.
Prima ch'io nascessi indifferente, la mia buona o cattiva sorte, dall'altro angolo che non dà questa visione crematorizzata, dalla mia e vostra vita terrorizzata. Se resistere dipende dal cuore, piuttosto dalle sottane sarà rotta la mistanghetta, la vita è sbersata per un attimo ancora. Se sesso è così rotativo da apparire poi, vana questo recitativo che mi faceva passare per pazza quando arrotondandomi dietro ad ogni scrivania sorvegliavo i vostri desideri d'essere lontani dalla mia, rotativa nella notte specchiata nel lucido del vetro che copre le vostre indifferenze alla mia stralunante morte.
And I see these rhythms giving rise to what is truly a new musical tempo, not andante, but a translingual stralunante, moon striking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was amazing. And I realized as you were speaking, I was like, oh, I was so worried about getting the PowerPoint set up. I didn't read your bio, so I'm reading it into the record now. So Jennifer Scappettone, who we've been so lucky to hear now, is Associate Professor of English, Creative Writing, and Romance Languages and Literatures, and Faculty Affiliate of Gender and Sexuality Studies, and of the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization at the University of Chicago, where she founded and currently directs the Environmental Humanities plus Arts Lab. She is the author of Killing the Moonlight, Modernism in Venice, Columbia University Press 2014, which was a finalist for the Modernist Studies Association's Book Prize, and of the forthcoming, which you just spoke about, Poetry After Barbarism, The Invention of Motherless Tongues and Resistance to Fascism, also Columbia University Press 2025. Locomotrix, her critical edition of Amelia Rosselli's selected poetry and prose, published in 2012 by the University of Chicago Press, won the biennial Raizzis de Palchi Book Prize for Poetry in Translation. She curates Pen Sound Italiana, devoted to avant-garde and otherwise eclipsed Italian poetics. Her own poetry has been translated and glossed by critics globally. Her most recent collection, devoted to Fresh Kills Landfill, and an anonymous Superfund listed dump across from her childhood home on Long Island, is The Republic of Exit 43. Thank you, Jennifer. And I will say that Jennifer's work has been an incredible kind of North Star to so many of us working on Rosselli now. It's iconic work. So I want to kind of just quickly talk a little bit about kind of Rosselli's relationship with music, acoustics, ethnomusicology, since that is really what my research focuses on. So these figure in spazi metrici, but I would argue even more prominently in the talk on metrics that Andrea and Phil have translated in this new edition. I just wanted to briefly give some background and contextualize some of her musical training and engagement. She began studying music seriously, playing the violin and the piano and the organ during her time at St. Paul's Girls' School in London in the late 1940s. And she continued taking lessons, including composition lessons, when she moved to Florence and then Rome in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Also in the early 1950s, she traveled to Paris to study recordings of folk music from around the world at Musée de l'Homme under the guidance of one of the founders of comparative musicology, Alain Danielou, as Jennifer said, deeply influenced her. But around the same time, she discovered anthropologist Ernesto De Martino's specific strain of ethnology and ethnography in the Italian South, thanks to her relationship with intellectuals thinking through the Southern question, namely Rocco Scotellaro and Carlo Levi. At the same time, De Martino was collaborating with a young Italian ethnomusicologist, Diego Carpitella, who is considered by many now to be the kind of founder of modern ethnomusicology in Italy. This can be disputed, but it's many, right, Nicola? Many agree with that. So Rosselli collaborated with Carpitella, and Carpitella and De Martino actually entrusted her with transcribing 150 folk songs from the southern Italian region of Basilicata into her kind of transcription system that she had come up with. The system of transcription, I'm going to show an image. It was something that she worked on for years. So starting from Paris in the early 1950s, through her time at the Darmstadt Ferienkurse, so she went in 1959 and 1961, where she learned from experimental composers like John Cage, David Tudor, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. German is not my language. But you can see that Rosselli was actually, I'm going to show it to you now. I'll share it for you too, Jennifer, though I'm sure you've seen it before. This is something that she made. You can see her trying to experiment with notating the parameters that she's describing in her discussions of language in the two paratexts that we've been focusing on today. So we have timbre, intensity, duration, frequency, we have amplitude. We have really a deep engagement with acoustic parameters of the time. Though what's interesting is that Rosselli takes parameters that are classed as physical or physiological and parameters that are cast instead by acousticians of the time as perceptual, and she conflates them together. I'll just leave that at that for now. It's a larger discussion. But in any case, it's really difficult for us to understand how Rosselli would have notated music using this schema and others like it, because all we have are incomplete sketches, a number of these. I think something like 12, maybe more than that. So we have little, if any, paratextual guidelines regarding how to read them. I cannot tell you how many hours I've spent with these, asked musicologists to spend with me, composers to spend with me. No, it's very difficult to understand without a gloss. As with many graphic notations at the time. Let me stop the share. So Rosselli's explanation of her poetry in her lecture on metrics and in Spazi Metrici, I don't think that they imply that her poems are a score, to my mind. They seem like more of a ricerca or a research project to try to understand the intersection of voice, sound, and language. We could maybe think that there are more intersections, but I think it's akin to what Berio and Maderna were trying to do, Luciano Berio and Bruno Maderna were trying to do with their Studio di Fonologia in Milan at the same time. And so actually a May 1962 letter that Rosselli wrote from Milan to her brother John contains the first reference to Spazi Metrici in her correspondence with John, which is very extensive. So she says, wrote a short essay to add to book in form of last page note called Spazi Metrici on problems of form and metrica in my poetry. So I think that's an interesting question of potentially writing Spazi Metrici, or a first draft while in Milan at the Studio di Fonologia. But I think in this respect, thinking about the poem and the relationship to score, we can see potentially an interesting divergence. I'm trying this out, so I'm interested if you all agree or not. But a divergence between Charles Olson, right, American poet who really influenced her, Charles Olson's idea of the poem's relationship to the score and Rosselli's. I mean, Olson was an essential point of reference for Rosselli. Jennifer has written about this, and Daniela La Penna. But he compares his notion of projective verse, of notating the breath in the poem, to a score towards the end of the first part of projective verse. He says, the poet is using the typewriter, quote, as a scoring to his composing, as a script to its vocalization, end quote. So it's for a poem that is meant to sound in a particular way, right? Not just to be read, he says, not only by the eye, but also by the ear. But there is still this kind of sense of the score being able to transmit a sound that then the performer or the receiver can replicate in some way. And I think Rosselli is similar to Olson in her attention to how a poem looked graphically on the page and how it sounded. But in Olson, I see a desire for the poet to kind of project his understanding of the sound onto the reader. And instead, what I see in Rosselli's poems and paratext, the poet's control over sound as an individual, I would argue, is much more limited. A poem's sound in Rosselli's formulation is instead something that seems to be being explored by the poet and the reader. And I'm also very intrigued by Andrea's assertion about it being shaped by historical circumstances as well. And I'm very interested in Andrea's formulation of Rosselli's idea of meter as, quote, an understanding of meter as a common ground of perception and communication, one that could allow the self and the other to become mutually intelligible, end quote, and that her metrical explorations seek to, quote, ground a community based not on mastery or dominance, but joint connivance and studious indiscipline, end quote. I find these to be very beautiful and thought-provoking formulations for me personally, as I seek to explore the roles and functions of various ideas of sound, score, recording technology in Rosselli's work. I think they're going to be thought-provoking to many other thinkers engaging in Italian post-war poetics as a whole. So thank you so much to both of you for your scholarship that you've shared today, the scholarship that you've also done in the past, which again has been very, very significant. I wanted to kick us off with a few questions to the three of you. And then also, please, audience, jump in. I'm thinking, I guess I'm going to start with a question that has been on my mind as I kind of saw the title of the event as I was circulating the page. And of course, the title of the book, too, the idea of delirious verse, right? And so she often talks about delirare. I think, how do we kind of square this, or how do you all conceive of this in your work as people who, Jennifer and Andrea, you were both talking about how spazi metrici has not been taken seriously and needs to be taken seriously. But so much of the dismissal of Rosselli's articulations of her own poetics seem to have been grounded in, an outsider status or kind of weird language, or potentially the kind of craziness that has marked much of her legacy. I'm curious what we do with delirious then in this context. I don't know if you want to. Jennifer, do you want to jump in?
Hey, it's a little awkward for me because I can't have the eye contact.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start by just making a confession.
Mm-hmm.
When I chose the word locomotrix as the, impossible to determine title of the selected poetry and prose of Amelia Rosselli, I was not, in fact, thinking of the word loco at all.
Yeah.
In a way, don't ask me, I was so inside of her brain, or, hoping to be, that it didn't even occur to me that folia, that craziness would enter, because I was so staunchly against reading her work in that way. As a feminist, and as someone that had read her complaints about not being taken seriously. The word locomotrix comes from tuo motivo non urlare, a poem in which she uses the feminine form of locomotive, which is a little bit weird. I mean, it can stand in standard Italian in any case, but for me, it was about my feminizing a word that was not typically feminized from the Latin and, in English. So it was about that. And afterwards, when someone, even a friend of mine, referred to her mental illness, in the context of the title, I was horrified. So I really do think that it would have been a good thing to ask, people who knew less about the project what their associations were. And, delirium can be strategic and so forth, but I did think about your question, in fact, Isabella. When I saw the title Delirious Verse, I felt a tad guilty because I thought, oh no, this thing that I did, has kind of, started like a certain trend. But I know that that's not what Andrea thinks either. And so I'm curious to hear your response.
Yeah, same.
Well, it's a very good question. It also makes me completely makes me feel awkward because it's actually the only paragraph that I really wanted to read from my afterword, and I didn't end up reading. And it's like, should I read it now? Should I kind of just repeat it? But basically, the title of this publication and the whole sort of idea of delirium, our thought also together with Phil was to sort of rescue or almost exorcise the word delirium from the connotation that it has in a sense of a pathologizing, pathologizing word or condition. Delirium comes from Latin, is the furrow going off, the plow going off the furrow, right?
Right, the plow going off the furrow.
So it's the kind of literally like it's a very technical term for sbandare or swerve. Going swerving, swerve. I found it interesting because I was reading Luigi Reitani's commentary on Hölderlin's Griechenland, and I found also kind of that was also the trigger. Phil published an incredible translation from Christopher Middleton of Hölderlin's poems, and we've been in this kind of close relationship in talking about poetry and metrics and the page, and somehow the revelation for me about delirium came from Hölderlin, or came from this commentary from Luigi Reitani that really speaks of the word Winkel as a convergence of verse and corner, and in a way for me this is also getting sort of deviating from the furrow. This idea of deviating from the furrow underscores, as I wrote, the deviation not only as a departure from the rut of the Italian literary tradition, but also indicates the start of a cross-language, cross-cultural, cross-national, cross-aesthetic, as Jennifer points out in her beautiful talk, and most probably in their upcoming book, I expect. And these kind of encounters and these kind of confrontations are something that Rosselli's work sort of deserves to have as a, I don't know, discursive reading next to. I guess, yeah. Maybe you have any.
No, I have nothing.
Can I ask a question then to the two of you? Thinking about, and Jennifer, if you have anything to say, obviously jump in as well. Thinking about typography, Andrea, you and I have talked about this, about how this is, I mean, you're kind of the person to do it, right? Being experts, right? But I do feel that part of Rosselli, the importance of typography in Rosselli's work has not been fully excavated, it seems to me. And so I'm kind of curious where Phil, why did this project appeal to you, I guess? And as typographers, like what do you guys have to say about it? If that's, not being a typographer myself, I apologize for the ignorance.
I can have a go at that question. Is this working? Yeah. Oh, it's into the. I see. Yeah. I agree, or I think I'm working quite a lot now on this. Some specific poets and their kind of the way in which they thought about typography and its relation to prosody, and also the kind of material production of poems and the kind of collaborations that often required and involved, and how that was also shaped by technology, changes in printing technology and typesetting technology, and how all these things were often sort of working together or in conflict or in tension or in contradiction with one another. All of which is to say that I think more broadly there's a kind of lack of interest or analysis in the ways in which poets have thought about typography. Let's say excluding poets who are explicitly visual or concrete poets. Just sort of, I've been these past few days kind of in various archives looking at correspondence between poets and their publishers, and there are these incredibly passionate, tense, often dialogues between poet and publisher about how their poems get put onto the page, and this kind of meticulous concern for all these kind of details of the kind of spatial presentation of language. Of course, the fact that Rosselli was a poet who was deeply concerned with these questions as well was something that immediately appealed to me before I, had even really sort of gone into any depth with Andrea in terms of discussing how it works. So there was a kind of immediate attraction or curiosity there for me. Maybe I can just say something else, that I think that this kind of lack of interest in the typographic, material, visual aspects of poetry is for me kind of symptomatic of a kind of surreptitious metaphysics that splits off like the kind of material aspects of the poem, considers that's a kind of arbitrary sort of container for the essential content of the meaning or something like that. So I suppose everything that I'm interested in my own work is trying to kind of a bit like collapse that split. But maybe I can just say something quickly to bring it a little bit more to what you were talking about with Olsen. I think just visually there's an interesting difference in the way that they use the page, in that Olsen with his projective verse and the whole kind of tradition that came out of that, of kind of open field poetics, was really taking the page as a kind of almost a territory that could be kind of claimed. I wouldn't necessarily push this reading too far as a general claim, but like for me there's something possibly kind of masculinist about that sort
Scholars
of
have argued it.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
that the page is a kind of blank territory that you kind of project out into. So there's something interesting to me that Rosselli, by contrast, despite her interest in and influence being influenced by Olsen, her space is a kind of contained block. And, you know, at least, okay, this changes, you know, throughout her career, but you understand what I'm saying.
And I'm just going to put up, this is a small thing, but I just typed this up really quickly in monospace as she would have wanted it. So it's
Exactly.
not quite a cube,
Yeah.
but this is kind of the block of text that she...
Yeah.
It's, I mean, Jennifer, it's just tutto il mondo è vedovo, which she kind of says is like the kind of main exponent of her, of this kind of verse.
So maybe just to finish, because I'm kind of rambling a bit perhaps, but I think that there's something interesting. I mean, what Jennifer was saying was so incredibly interesting, is the poem is, or like this kind of idea of a prosody that can contain all possible rhythms from all possible languages, and that maybe this kind of cubic form is some kind of container or like holding space, or I don't know, panic room or something that can kind of like, that needs this kind of hard defined limits in order not to, I don't know. That's just a thought I had. But maybe Andrea.
No, yeah. I mean, we've been talking also about this the last few days. What to add? I completely agree with the Olsen analysis, and I think it's also maybe sort of long due to say it so vocally, so well put. I think from also Jennifer already touched upon it before, and you as well. But it's the typography, like the cube, the square. Let's say it's the polemics that Jennifer also put out with Giovannuzzi also in a sort of way. I completely agree. Like I find myself completely agreeing in that sense.
I didn't say.
Polemics, it's let's say it's a dialectical word. It's the 1st of May. We can allow that dialectics, right? It's just a question of, I truly believe as a reader of Rosselli I'm not an expert, but I believe as a reader of Rosselli that this, as Jennifer claims, that this sort of idea remains. The idea of the space, of the metrical space, remains throughout. It morphs. It kind of reaches out to something that maybe has maybe a less evidently square-like graphic form, but I've been extremely interested in looking at. Maybe you have you caught it in my extremely lengthy forward. That I'm extremely interested in looking also at this potential idea that within this cube there are accents at play. There are accents that the reader also somehow needs to be accountable for. There is this kind of movement, rhythmical movement, where, let's say, meter is a matrix. Also, in terms of typographical matrix, I would say there is this idea that I find perhaps needs to be more explored also, but the idea of a typographical matrix also in terms of printing technologies. Like for Rosselli and for other authors of that period, you notice that the typography becomes, the typographical grid almost becomes like a substitute for the mother tongue. It's like is a language in itself, the graphicity of the language. And it's very far away from concrete poetry or the way that concrete poets would understand it. It's extremely connected to rhythm, to semantics, to grammar, to also a sabotaging of these. But it's within the text, it's not outside of the text, so to say.
Jennifer, do you have something that you want to add? Or
I guess I would just briefly add that I was very galvanized as a poet who is interested in visual forms by this whole thing, and remain convinced that Rosselli, with desktop publishing at her fingertips, would have done something really interesting. At the same time, there is the insistence that she's not a visual poet. And I find that really interesting. And I think that reading her too literally, as certain illustrious, scholars have, just why? There can be a geometric, abstract conception that is still guides the thing, and to make it so literal as that is almost to really misunderstand. And it's also something that's typical of reading women writers, that it somehow has to be like carnalized or materialized. So when it comes to the tuning of the sphere, the harmony of the spheres, there are all kinds of graphs of that, but no one thinks that is actually visible. It's only audible. So I find that tension to be really interesting. And I admit that when I was a graduate student and I was kind of like making my own square poems for my first book of poems, I was a little like, oh, she doesn't want to be a visual poet. But now I understand why, because it was so a la mode. Like it was she didn't want to be part of any movement, any ism. And I just love how trenchantly independent she was of all that.
I want to open it up to our audience to see if you have any questions, anything that you guys want to talk about or ask. Yeah, I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Oh,
we have to. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. This is more just a few thoughts that I'm having and hearing, kind of this continuity between matrix and metrics, even though etymologically I guess they're different. But her theories of music seem to, and maybe this is part of the resistance against the visual reading, which would kind of restrict the poem, see the poem as form imposed on the territory. But the idea of music, her metrics is that it is like a matrix-like, in the sense that you're inside of this universal music, which of course matrix is also related to mother and matter. So I guess the question is the idea of a matrix actually, rather than a cube or this sort of pure geometric form, because you also talked about how her cube combines, or use the word conflates, different principles that are actually are kind of divergent. Whether that idea of a matrix would be proper to read her metrics. As a way of escaping this idea of, meter as sort of form imposed upon sound, or, So it's just more of a provocation than
I think Andrea has a lot to say about it. I mean, I don't know. It's in your afterword.
Am I? So I need to respond. Complex. Thanks. It was I think it's a thought-provoking comment. It's somehow like hearing you explain it, I felt like it's almost like an alternative to the cube form. Like, could we call it like a matrix instead of a cube? Or could she have called it like a matrix instead of a... for me, I don't know, I guess maybe I have a limited... It's in my afterword, it's a bit of a afterword thought that needs to be maybe further developed, and needs to be more Entwicklungsfähigkeit to it, like a development, conceptual development. But I thought about it, maybe I can say that. I thought about it in relation also to how much the English language is extremely important to Rosselli, and in relation also to what Jennifer was explaining, let's say this idea of the poem or the cube containing all these languages, this kind of multilingual form that can allow for these languages to perform in some way. I had to think about her mother, of course. I have to think about Marian Cave, and the fact that the way that she started also writing Diario in trilingue, and that let's say, the English language was extremely important for her, also simultaneously to Variazioni Belliche. So the fact that there is a lot of Italian scholarship that argues that Rosselli decided to pick up Italian and decided to make Italian as a language, preferred language of writing when she came to Italy. She wrote Sleep at the same time as Variazioni Belliche. So she was truly bilingual. She was truly speaking two languages. In that sense, I see the Matrix could apply in that sense. Like the mother, I don't know, Kamau Brathwaite has a poem called Mother Poem, and my thesis is about a discrepant engagement between these two authors. I've been thinking about also making a close reading that had to, could sort of highlight what this kind of, matrilineal, patrilineal lineage could have to do with the way that, of course, language and nation and a culture is kind of transferred into the scheme of rhythms that are an author.
Follow up regarding these geometric figures, I think, and then I'll let
And then
somebody else
we
speak.
gotta wrap it soon.
But
we gotta
the idea of the matrix is it sort of prioritizes the node or the vertex, the intersections, and it's sort of like we often think of a net. And your title, Delirious Verse, I mean, the verse is the turning of the line. It's not the line. But the verse is often, the turning is often subordinated to the priority of the line. And that's also like the idea of cultivation, like the Georgic image. But so Delirious Verse is actually like delirium, but not of the line, but of the turning. So I just think it's what it would mean for poetics to stay on the turn rather than subjecting the turn as just a way to make another line. But I think that is analogous to the idea of the matrix, because instead of having this form that contains everything, you have rather the nodes, which are all turns or vertexes, like verses in that sense. Okay, sorry.
Maybe Jennifer wants to say something.
I would just jump in quickly and say that, I understand the matrix. I talk about the modernist grid as a matrix of much thinking in the post-war period, and that I do understand Rosselli's, cube form as a matrix. And, the subtitle of my book is The Invention of Motherless Tongues. So there's a whole thing about the matrix and the mother and the nurse and so forth.
Very cool.
But thank you for also reminding me to say that locomotrix was not about, it was about motion. It was also meant to signal this kind of rhyme. Locomotrix, locomatrix, locometrics. And it was not about mental illness in any way. And so that's why I didn't hear the mental illness bit, because I was listening for all those other resonances. But yeah.
We're going to just have one more question, then anybody else who has questions, you can come and talk to us, just so that our student worker can go home.
No, thank you so much for letting us hear a sound clip, because I think there is an amazing amount of information in the way she delivers her poetry. It's so hard to follow her analogies with music and geometry. You understand it is highly idiosyncratic, and in the end, I think this is the fascination of Rosselli. On the one hand, so open to languages between disciplines, from Musée de l'Homme to Darmstadt, so au courant with all these incredible experiences, but then with this apparent necessity of having a highly, at the same time, very methodologically developed but highly personalized science of verse. And my question is about precisely her whether or not she had knowledge of her of the science of verse that had developed in the years before. I'm thinking particularly, between the 1880s and 1940s, in France, in Germany, in the US, in the UK, there are lots of exciting research, all attempting kind of somehow to capture the essence of versification, the essence of poetry. Those are, names like E.W. Scripture or Ernst Brücke, who was one of Freud's teachers, Amedeo Gentili in Austria, Givler also. these are people that sometimes they invent new devices to be applied to the lips, so that you kind of have ways of transcribing the delivery of verses, linking it to a possible psychology of emotions, etc. It's kind of a story that runs also parallel to experimental attempts in poetry to find a new elementarization of the verse. So what is the actual constituent of poetry? Since this is something that Rosselli also is involved with. So what are the elements? Is the word the element of poetry? You think of Cubo-Futurist, Dada, of course, the lettrist. So I'm wondering, did Rosselli try to tap into this science of verse tradition, that includes also Russian structuralists, this whole science of verse between the end of the 19th century and what do you say?
Well, I'm going to pass the mic. I will say part of what I'm working on is the engagement with acoustics, textbooks in music at the time, that were quantifying and trying to classify, especially in the US, the vowel. And so like pitches of the vowel. So I'm not sure about versification, but there was an interest in kind of, also the sine wave. It's about the kind of scientific depiction of what that sound is. But I'm not sure. I don't know if Andrea and Jennifer have more kind of about Rosselli's engagement with previous metrical kind of, or theories of.
Oh, sorry. Wait, maybe. Yeah. Very interesting question. It's something I've been also kind of trying to come to terms with, and I don't have any, let's say, specific sort of yet proofs or like sort of a lineage. I think the closest lineage is the music theory that she's working, the acoustics, the harmonics. Yeah, harmonic series. See. But I don't know. For me, there is a potential. Like we've been discussing this with Phil a lot because we've been also reading poets that did things that have an assonance somewhat to this kind of attempt. But I mean, makes Rosselli's attempt remain a little bit of an attempt, a little bit standalone. But I could mention authors like, which she of course didn't read, but for us extremely. I don't know, maybe could be an interesting case study or like comparative study. Douglas Oliver, English poet, and also lived in New York also for a while. He did an incredible study on the performance of poetry. There is a colloquium in Princeton from 4 or 5 years ago. Meredith Martin is part of the scholars that also started or contributed. Yopi Prince. There is like a kind of a scene now since 10 years, 15 years that really tries to analyze a little bit more also with digital technologies and technical ground, the delivery of poetry and try to look at prosody also from that perspective. But I cannot say there is something that Rosselli, the closest is I think your research, I would say, or the things that we spoke about so far. I think the way that you demonstrate, the way that she thought about sound and thought about acoustics and thought about harmonics. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe Jennifer has something to say.
Jennifer wants to take us out.
Yeah, I would agree. That's not a rabbit hole that I have gone down. I have gone more down the line of, acoustics. This has to do really with her education. A lot of her education was musical. So that's actually what makes her work so unique, because she ended up not being a composer. I mean, we haven't even mentioned that she made an instrument. There were all kinds of things that she was thinking of doing, and she ended up residing in the world of poetics. But as far as I have seen, and I don't live in Italy, so it's like impossible for me to really do the deep dive into the Viterbo library because like what is already there is already so complicated that it took me so many years to understand the harmonic series. I do believe that because she had this formal and informal education in music, that is where she's coming from, and she's creating her own poetics out of that world. But it is, if some student wants to go down that rabbit hole, I think it would be really fascinating. I would love to learn more about this tradition that you're talking about.
There is an essay, actually. I can't remember the author, but I've encountered it. It's an Italian, I think, recently graduated PhD student that actually made the first, wrote an essay with, he's in Torino because there is the sonology, I think, Institute for Sonology there at the university, but he's from literary studies, and he wrote an essay on Rosselli, trying to feed in the voice of Rosselli, analyzing what comes out in terms of what you're actually saying. I could look it up and give it to you. It just came to me. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to have to close this here. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being on Zoom. Thank you so much to Andrea and Phil for being here. Grazie mille. Wish the volume was here, but this is what we do. Thanks so much. All right. Have a great...
Ciao, Jennifer. Thank you.
Have a great evening. Ciao. Ciao, ciao.